Well, we have reached the end of our series in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's been such a fun study, looking at the tale of two kings and how both leave us with great expectations and longing for the one true king we see in Jesus Christ, the Son of David. And I can say, and can I just say, praise God that today's text is not the end of the story, right? And maybe the end of 1st and 2nd Samuel, but the true king has come in the second person of the Trinity. So as we close this series out, we want to discover all that we can about God's faithfulness and mercy and steadfastness and justice, and at the same time know that all of that culminates in the person and work of Jesus Christ. David's life had a much greater purpose than being an earthly king. He was a type of Christ. He was a shadow of what is to come. And it would be through his line that God faithfully provides the king who has not only come for the Jews, but for all the nations everywhere. And so our main point this morning is this: the life of Israel's best king pointed to a more righteous king, a better shepherd, and a spotless sacrifice. The life of Israel's best king pointed to a more righteous king, a better shepherd, and a spotless sacrifice. David is arguably Israel's best king, right? But even their best king was not enough to solve the problem of their sin and separation from God. Their best king could not be righteous like they needed. He could not be the shepherd that they needed, and he could not be the sacrifice that they needed. David's life points to someone who would be all of those things. And the last section of 2 Samuel is also the third and final piece of a chiastic structure that started in chapter 21. It begins with Saul's failures and David's mighty men, and then today we have David's mighty men again and David's failure. And in chapter 21, David's weakness was highlighted in the section about his mighty men and their battle with the Philistines. And this time, what is highlighted is his mighty men's loyalty and faithfulness to David. Yes, there is still an element of weakness, but what we see is a staggering commitment of those mighty men to David to the point of shedding their own blood and laying down their lives for him. And I believe this is meant to show the greatness of David right before we see a miserable fall of David. Let's look at chapter 23 together. In verses 8 through 12, we are introduced to three men known as the Three. And these are David's closest warriors. They are also David's most loyal and most lethal warriors. And here are their stories. In verse 8, we are introduced to Josheb, who is the leader of the three. And there is no surprise as to why. He killed 800 men at one time with his spear. These are personal kills. This is not like a troop of men that he led that killed 800 men. These are Josheb's kills. These are his own kills. He later in 1 Chronicles 27 will be appointed as the commander of the 1st division of David's army, a mighty man indeed. The second of the three is Eleazar. He has been with David for quite some time, and the legend that he is known for is that he was in battle for so long that even though his hand grew weary, he never released his sword. He kept his grip on his sword, and it almost became like another member of his body. And in that day, God brought great victory to him. And the only part that the other soldiers played in that battle was to comb through the dead bodies and take what was valuable. He did this all on his own. Again, another incredible solo act, but not outside of God's sovereignty and providence, as is clear in verse 10. Lastly, we have Shammah, who stood his ground on a plot of land, even though everyone else fled. And he defeated the group of Philistines for that plot, and God worked a great victory for him. We're given this introduction to these three men not only to show their might, but to show their great importance to David and to his victories, never forgetting that God ultimately is the one who gives the victory. And right in the middle of these incredible stories is this very odd story of David longing for waters in his hometown. Look at verses 13 through 17 with me. And 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came about harvest time to David at the cave of Adullam, when a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then at Bethlehem. And David said longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem that is by the gate." Then the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate and carried it and brought it to David. But he would not drink of it. He poured it out to the Lord and said, "Far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives?" Therefore, he would not drink it. And these things the 3 mighty men did. In the heat of the days of harvest, David and his men are at war with the Philistines. And it's not clear when this is, but the timing doesn't matter to the point of the text. They are in the cave of Adullam, as the garrison of Philistines was close by at Bethlehem. And David began to long for water, but not just any water. He wanted the water at Bethlehem. But not just any water at Bethlehem. He wanted it from a specific well by a specific gate. And he says, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem that is by the gate." I'm sure many of you can remember as a kid playing out, maybe you do this today, I don't know. But you're playing outside on a hot summer day and you're drinking from the hose, right? Now that's a big no-no, but back then it was okay. And that hose water had a particular flavor, right? Not necessarily good, but also not bad either. It was distinct. And for some reason, it was so incredibly refreshing on those hot summer days. And you can probably remember the taste right now, even years later. David is away from home, and all he wants is that water that he remembers. This is less about him being thirsty and more about him being homesick. He has grown weary. He is longing for home. He is human. And David, with this expression, is not intending for anyone to actually go through with this wish. This was just a longing and a wish that was expressed, not a command. But 3 men step up and decide to grant David this wish. These 3 men break through the camp of the Philistines, most likely at night while they were sleeping, and brought water back from that well to David. David has a surprising response to these men and their accomplishments. He grabs the bucket and exclaims to the Lord, "I can't drink this. It would be as if I was drinking the blood of my men, for they risked their lives for this water. They put their lives on the line. This is too much for me." And he pours it out to the Lord as if like a drink offering to God. Kind of rude, David, right? I mean, kind of rude. All right, these men risked their lives to get you this water. But David saw it as a sacrifice. He saw it as an offering to the Lord, and he no doubt was filled with gratitude, but also feeling the weight of the loyalty of his men to do something so dangerous for this water, right? And verse 17 ends by saying that these men, the 3 mighty men, that this was a normal occasion where they put their lives on the line regularly for David, that they did things like this for David. And the point of this section is not only to point out the weakness of David and his humanness with his longing for home, but we're supposed to see the valor and loyalty of these men and how they gave their lives in service to him. There's a case that's kind of being made right before David falls that we're supposed to see. David was a good king. A king who men dedicated and risked their lives for, even if that meant to fetch him water at the risk of bloodshed. But David understood he was not worthy of this. And so he pours it out. God, this is yours. You are worthy of this. And I'm just a man. All right, text continues with 2 more stories of men of valor and might. First, we have Abishai, the brother of Joab. He was the chief of the group of 30 men and was known for wielding his spear and killing 300 men at once. He gained a name for himself and even was renowned among the 30, but verse 19 tells us that he did not attain to the 3. Secondly, we have Benai, a doer of great deeds, and he was known for killing 2 champions of Moab taking down a lion in a pit in the snow and killing an Egyptian with his own spear. He also gained a name for himself, but he did not attain to the 3. Still a mighty man, still part of the 30, but not attaining to the 3. And David eventually sets him over his bodyguard. Lastly, in verses 24 through 39, we have a list of mighty men, most of them in the group of 30. There are about 37 in total. 30, the mighty 30 was just kind of a name for them. There wasn't exactly 30. Here it says there are 37. So why the long list of names and the grand stories? The author is wanting us to see the might of these men, the valor of these men, the loyalty of these men, the weakness of David, and yet the loyalty his men had for him. And I believe the author wants us to see this because it makes what happens next an even greater failure. God gave David mighty men. God gave them the victory over their enemies, and 3 men in particular who killed hundreds at one time. God had equipped David with everything that he needed. God proved over and over again that if David trusted in him, that he would faithfully provide victory and blessing. But the inclusion of Uriah the Hittite at the end of this section is a looming reminder of David's failure as well as the direction that the author is about to go. Chapter 24, the last chapter of our passage, despite God's providence in Israel and David's life, he fails to trust in the Lord and makes a critical error. And at the same time, God's mercy and David's response points to a Messiah who will take away the sins of his people. Let's start in verses 1. We'll read 1 through 4, and then we'll jump to 8 and 9. It says this: "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go number Israel and Judah.' So the king said to Joab, the commander of the army, who was with him, 'Go through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the number of the people.' But Joab said to the king, 'May the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still see it. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?' But the king's word prevailed against Joab and the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel." Jump down to verse 8. "So when they had gone through all the land, they came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. And Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to the king. In Israel there were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000. Our passage begins with God's anger against Israel. Israel had done something, it doesn't say, but they had done something that God saw fit to discipline or to judge. And so David is incited against his own people and does an unlawful census. And before we move on, we have to address something that we see in comparison with this passage to 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. 1 Chronicles 21:1 says this: "Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel." Our passage communicates that God incites David against Israel, but 1 Chronicles 21 communicates that Satan incites David against his people. So which is true? Is David encouraged by God or by Satan? Yes. Yes, here is how both can be true. 1 and 2 Samuel has a strong emphasis on the sovereignty and providence of God over all things. God raises up evil in David's house, which is surprising. God anoints David as king. God causes victory and he causes defeat. God in his providence is working all things according to his will and his plan for the redemption of mankind. God incites David in the sense that God permits Satan to tempt and entice David by his own desires to sin in order that God may judge Israel for their wickedness through this unlawful census. This is similar to the story of Job, where God calls to Satan's mind Job as a faithful man, and Satan asks to tempt him, to destroy him, to take things away in order that Job may deny God and rebel against him. God grants Satan permission to do this request. Is God sovereign over that situation? Yes. Is God's providence acting in that situation? Yes. Is Satan at work in that situation? Yes. So the 30,000 foot view is God in his providence is working in order to use David as a tool for judgment against Israel. The 10,000-foot view from 1 Chronicles is that Satan is inciting David against his own people. Both are true. But here's the good news. What Satan means for evil, God means for good. The judgment of a wicked people is right and good, for they've angered God. They've sinned against God. They have somehow sinned against him, and God's judgments are always true and always right. What Satan intends to do, which has caused David to fall and Israel to suffer, God purposes for correction and discipline and ultimately redemption. David calls for a census, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. There are laws and regulations for censuses in Exodus 30. There are certain purposes for censuses. But Joab, who David commanded to implement the census, tries to talk David out of it. Joab even encourages David with God's goodness. God is able to add Israel 100 times over, David. Don't do this. Don't delight in this thing, this wicked motivation, this pipe dream, whatever this thing is, delight in God and not it. David is taking a lawful thing and implementing it for his own pleasure, his own delight, and not God's pleasure or God's delight. Again, this passage does not say what David's exact intentions are, but based on Joab's rebuke, David's intentions with the census are wrong. And it's very possible that David intends to expand beyond what God has given Israel, or David is trusting in soldiers and horses rather than God, and the census is a way to instill confidence in his army rather than trusting in God. We just don't know. But David ignores Joab's pushback, and because he is king, the census moves forward. Well, God in his providence uses David's own desires, permits Satan in some manner to incite David, and David does a census with wicked delight in something other than God and his glory. God is sovereign over the incitement. Satan is permitted, but David is still responsible. For it is David's own desires that he acts upon. David is Israel's best king, but even Israel's best king repeatedly falls short. And it doesn't take long for David's heart to be struck with conviction. Look at verse 10 with me. But David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people. And David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. David is moved with conviction and understands that what he has done is great sin, he calls it. And he asks God to remove his iniquity, to forgive him, to cleanse him. And it's important to note the difference here between Saul and David. David, after sinning, is struck with conviction. And what does he do? He runs to God and confesses his sin. And he asks for God to remove the guilt, to remove the iniquity. He humbles himself before the Lord. It doesn't take a prophet this time to make David aware of his sins. His heart is soft. David does not receive an immediate answer, but instead, God speaks to a prophet named Gad, and in the morning, David is confronted with the words of the Lord. Look at verses 11 through 15 with me. And when David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and say to David, thus says the Lord, 3 things I offer you. Choose one of them that I may do it to you. So Gad came to David and told him and said to him, Shall 3 years of famine come to you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days of pestilence in your land? Now consider and decide what answer I shall return to him who sent me. Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great. But let me not fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel from the morning until the appointed time. And there died of the people from Dan to Beersheba 70,000 men. God speaks to Gad and tells him to present David with 3 options, 3 consequences or judgments for David's sin. The first 2 options would leave Israel very much exposed to the enemy. And the last option, though harmful, would at least be quick and wouldn't give the enemy time to attack. So David, in great distress over his sin and consequences, exclaims, "Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into the hand of man." David leans upon the character of God and trusts that God will be merciful, and maybe the full weight of his judgment will not fall on him or Israel. The Lord in his justice sends pestilence, and 70,000 Israelites die. The sins of the king once again directly affecting the nation and its people, as we've seen over and over again. And at the same time, God is providently judging Israel from verse 1. And at the same time, both are happening. Israel needs a better king. Israel needs an intercessor. Israel needs a new heart. Part of God's judgment upon Israel is an angel of destruction. And as the angel is dealing out justice of God, God relents because of his mercy, and David calls for the judgment to fall on him instead of his people. Look at verses 16 and 17 with me. "And when the angel stretched out his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who was working destruction among the people, 'It is enough. Now stay your hand.' And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. Then David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking the people and said, 'Behold, I have sinned and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house.'" What a wild series of events. Part of God's judgment on Israel is this angel who is going around striking people, most likely with pestilence. And the angel begins to move towards Jerusalem. And God acts on his mercy and tells the angel, "It's enough." And it's possible this is in response to David's cry, but whether it is or not, it is absolutely merciful. So the angel does not strike Jerusalem, but he is close by at the threshing floor of Araunah. And David sees the angel striking the people and calls out to God, "Behold, I have sinned, but these sheep have done nothing. Strike me instead." David once again calls for God's judgment to be on him rather than his people. He did this with his son Absalom, and now here with his people. David's desire is to be the subject of God's wrath for the sins of his people. But we can't forget, David has sinned. David is a tool of judgment in this scenario. So even though this is a valiant thing, even though this is a Messiah-like thing, David cannot be the sole subject of God's wrath and judgment, for he himself is an unworthy sacrifice. And I love that David calls Israel sheep, and this paints the picture of David as this shepherd king, and the shepherd king wants nothing more than to protect his sheep. But Israel needs a better shepherd. God responds to David through his prophet Gad in verses 18 through 25. And in this section, we have God instructing David on how to make atonement for his sins and for the sins of his people. Look at verses 18 through 25. "And Gad came that day to David and said to him, 'Go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite.' So David went up to Gad at Gad's word, as the Lord commanded. And when Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Araunah went out and paid homage to the king with his face to the ground. And Araunah said, 'Why is my lord the king come to his servant?' And David said, 'To buy the threshing floor from you, in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people.' Then Araunah said to David, 'Let my lord the king take it and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king,' Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, 'May the Lord your God accept you.' But the king said to Araunah, 'No, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing.' So David brought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. David's desire is for the judgment to end, as any good king would want, even offering up himself as a sacrifice. But God gives David another way. He tells David through his prophet to raise up an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah. David goes to Araunah and tells him that he has come to buy the threshing floor and to build an altar and to make a sacrifice in order to stop the plague. And Araunah is so excited that he offers the threshing floor and the animals and the wood for the fire. And then he says, "May the Lord your God accept you." Interesting words. But David refuses to take it for free and says, "I will not offer a burnt offering to the Lord that costs me nothing." A sacrifice requires the offering to belong to the offerer. A sacrifice by nature is costly. And David understands that. And Araunah agrees to sell it to David, and he builds an altar on which he offers a burnt offering and peace offerings. And the Lord responds to the plea for the land, and the plague is averted from Israel, similar to how we saw in chapter 21. Something worth noting. In the same location that David builds an altar and offers a sacrifice for his sins and for Israel, many years prior to this, God provided a ram for Abraham to offer instead of his son Isaac in this same location. And in just a short amount of time, this same exact location will be the location of the temple that David's son will build. And a series of temporary sacrifices will be offered here, for a righteous king is needed. A better shepherd is needed. A perfect sacrifice is needed. David was a good king, but because of his sin, he could never be the king Israel needed in order to fulfill the promises that God had made to his people. The end of this series should point us to the providence of God and the giving of a king, the sovereignty of God and how he works his plan, ultimately ending in redemption. And yet it should lead us to be satisfied only in the horn of salvation that is our King, Jesus Christ. And I want to end by reading and reflecting on Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2, where all this began. So look at 1 Samuel 2. It says this. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she has many children in forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up. The Lord makes poor and he makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit the seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. There is a costly sacrifice accepted by God for the sins of the world, and it's not a bull, and it's not a ram, and it's not David. It's a lamb. The horn of salvation, Jesus Christ. And it is in Jesus that God judges the ends of the earth. It is in Jesus that the sins of the elect are paid for. It is in Jesus where we find the perfect justice and perfect mercy of God meeting. For there is none holy like the Lord. There is no rock like Jesus. He is where God's wrath is satisfied. He is where the anger is quenched. And it is by him that the plague on the land is lifted. David is, in his cry to God, said, I have sinned, but my sheep have done nothing. And Jesus cries out, I have done nothing, and my sheep have done everything wrong. Yet I will take the punishment, and I will lay myself upon the altar. And God acts upon his mercy for us by dealing out justice on his Son. And you are accepted because of that perfect sacrifice and by grace through faith. David, surrounded by mighty men, encouraged to trust in numbers, failed to trust in God, and failed to heed the part of Hannah's prayer that says, not by might shall man prevail. The whole story of 1st and 2nd Samuel really can kind of be summed up by that statement, right? Not by the might of man shall he prevail. There's no earthly king who by his might can prevail. There is no earthly king who will be born that will satisfy the wrath of God against sinful man. It is only the God-man, Jesus Christ, that we are lifted from death to life. And so the application really is simple. It's just one question. Are you trusting in the true King, Jesus Christ, to prevail on your behalf? Or are you trusting in your own might? And it's interesting that at the end of our series, David is failing to trust in God's strength and instead opting to trust in his own strength, his mighty men, and in his numbers. There's no might, there's no army, there's no amount of good that you can heap up to avoid the wrath of God or to satisfy his justice. God will be just. He will be righteous. Everyone will answer for their actions, but praise be to God that he's provided a king, a shepherd, a horn of salvation, who is lifted up on a cross as a spotless sacrifice in the place of you and me. And we are accepted in him. By God's grace, he opens up our blind eyes and awakens our dead hearts to the reality that Jesus Christ is King, and in faith we trust in him. And when you trust in him, what you are saying is, Jesus is indeed the Son of God, who died for me, who was raised on the third day, and it is by his blood that I am cleansed. It's not by anything that I can do. It's not by how many times I've read the Bible. It's not by how many times I've gone to church. If you've trusted in Jesus to prevail on your behalf, then your life is his, and he is yours. And at the end of our passage, it says that the Lord heard the plea and lifted the plague from the land. Praise be to God that he has listened to the plea of his Son, and he's lifted our sins off of us. Let's pray.